honestly, reading your paper, I was really surprised that who you are is actually, it's such an important question. It always felt like an important question, but in sort of a wrong direction. It was more of a cosmetically important question. What is your identity? How do you feel? But it actually allows you to make decisions, and that was sort of on the surface, but I couldn't grasp it before you pointed it out, so to speak.
Yeah.
It reminds me of this convergence points or something people preach in those hippie retreats, like you have to, your assembly point. Your assembly point is actually really important.
In my opinion, there's a reason why so many traditions are saying similar things about the self when it comes to letting go of the self and letting something else greater than you guide you. There is something scientifically relevant to exactly that point. And essentially that's what almost all contemplative and religious traditions are pointing to is you are small, whatever you is. and then something greater than you is part of you, but also you are part of it. And in being with it, in your communion with it, an optimal path sort of arises in that sense. Like, I mean, the Christian traditions would say something along the lines of like you are the lamp that lights my path and you walk with me in that regard. So like there's this aspect there, but then like contemplative traditions like, Buddhism or whatnot would say like you are one with the universe. And so when you let go of the self, you become one with the universe. And they're hitting on very similar ideas in that regard.
Since you talk about different modes of consciousness, this is what religions try to inspire in a sense. This mode of simultaneous presence with the universe sort of feels like this electromagnetic field that happens in the world and incorporates you. And there's, different ways to describe that. I treat it quite metaphorically, but I'm starting to think right away of different mysticism schools. For example, I know that medieval Islamic mysticism was talking about us as the parts of the great light of Allah that are supposed to converge all together into one great light of God. And there's always an idea of losing your identity to an extent and taking some sort of a superposition in this world when you are not yet happened. It's like it happens also in Taoism. I think this is sort of thing with the baby that you're supposed to give, like a metaphorical, this religious baby that is born inside your stomach, and then you move it through chakras upwards.
Yeah.
They always some sort of a melting down of your ego involved in that sort of thing.
Yes.
So that was massively interesting. I think for me, maybe the most of a revelation, this state of superposition. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more of how this actually works.
So, well, it's a packed question because it depends on what level of the mechanism you want to talk about. Because if you want to talk about, our sense of self, the sense of self itself is, again, we haven't actually published on this officially yet, but basically what the switching paper was pointing at was that the default mode network is involved essentially in creating the boundary conditions of how we reconstruct the informational landscape underneath that creates our sense of self at any given moment. Because if you ask who is Anton right now, something will come to mind. And if I ask you who is Anton, you will say something. But then the question is, why did those words come out of your mouth first? Why was that how you articulated who you are when you could have said potentially anything about the last multiple decades of your conscious life that could constitute who you are right now? So there's something in our articulation, in the process of thinking itself, that forces you to provide a constrained answer on what is you right now. But at the fundamental level, the question is, where is that information stored about who you are, your memories, your model of the world, of yourself, how you think, who you think you are versus what you think the world is? And then how do you compress that into a current belief about yourself? So there's some sort of measurement going on about who I am right now. But then the question is does that constitute who you actually are in some real objective sense? Or is that just a current measurement of an ongoing thing that is always evolving? And if that's the case, if that's the case, then please go ahead.
Because it's really I need to drop a penny for the evolving system, because it is so Deleuzian, for that matter, if you think of that. That's precisely how he was describing it, and precisely the question I had after reading Deleuze. And how is that supposed to work? The body without organs is a mind, so to speak, as an ever reconstructing system that can only crystallize in response to some sort of a intention. There should be a desire present there that is always mystical for those people, that somehow makes the crystallization of something solid possible. Yeah, so that is sort of what you're talking about. Are you also on that? Do you also think in this direction?
That's interesting, because then it brings up a question about where does intention originate? What's the cause of the cause of the cause? And so then you can go down this rabbit hole, the philosophical rabbit hole of, well, why do you want the thing you want? And then you can keep asking why until you end up at an I don't know. And
yeah, pretty much. You can start questioning everything. Yeah. But if you start questioning everything, you stay inside this consecutive thinking mode, or does it mean that when you're deeply questioning yourself, you cut yourself away from multiple possibilities? This distributed thinking.
Okay, yeah. So then that would go back to the original question. So that would be the idea here, is that when the self-referential thinking, so the default mode network is this area of the brain, this circuit in the brain that is well researched and significant literature on. It is the few areas of the brain that create this coherent self-narrative that's responsible for who I am. And when I ask you who you are, you respond. And then if you have EEG on the brain, the default mode network areas will be the ones using the most energy to reply. So it is what's constituting the significant amount of an answer when you ask, who am I? And then the opposite is true. So this is like one of the biggest studies of the last 15 years was Carhart-Harris et al. In 2014, who used EEG during psilocybin. And it was heavily correlated with the dissolution of the ego. So 66% of the variance of ego dissolution was explained by alpha in the default mode network regions. So that points to the fact that those areas are what constitute the reconstruction of what we call ourself at some level. The question is, where is that being stored? How is it reconstructing? And what is the mechanism at which it's doing so? But then that would, of course, but then that's the idea here, is that from the energy perspective, that is what's maintaining the boundary between me now and me, the possibilities of me. So that's kind of what you're getting at here, is where's the line between the evolving self and the current self? And it seems to be the default mode network, and psychedelic research really strongly points to that. But that's where the switching paper connects the two, which had not been connected in literature before, was between psychedelic research and flow state research. So flow states, the opposite happens. Well, not the opposite, but a correlated effect happens where you have a dissolution of self when you're locked into the zone and you're doing something where you're like, wow, this was an incredible 2 hours that went by without feeling like 2 hours. And I felt like I got so much done in that time, or it was the most creative, incredible time of my life. What EEG finds in that when you measure the default mode network is the default mode network is quiet during that time, and the energy has shifted to task relevant regions. So the research that we cite in the paper was a tightrope study where the default mode network went totally quiet while these participants went on a tightrope across like a crevice and like some sort of rock climbing adventure. And
if you start questioning if you start questioning your decisions when you're climbing a rock, it's probably not the best scenario.
Exactly. And so that would be the idea here, is that kind of forces the flow state to occur, is that the body's like, okay, now is not the time to think about how to do this. Now is the time to act, And so, but that actually shuts down. The same thing happens, is your sense of self disappears, but it's the same effect that happens with taking psychedelics. Your sense of self disappears, but the psychedelics are obviously a more universal across the brain because it binds to all receptors across the brain at that level. So it shuts down the entire alpha band, essentially the entire alpha band at that level. And so one paper that was really interesting recently was a certain strain of DMT essentially like instantaneously shuts down alpha bands across the entire board. And like that's so far the most powerful evidence for like the fact that the self is directly correlated to alpha band in the DMT, or I mean alpha band in the DMN, and and DMT is what points to this. So all that to say is, the idea here is that at one level, at the high level, the neuronal level, which creates this most significant electromagnetic energy that can be measured by EEGs on the brain, though that energy is what's maintaining our sense of self. The question then becomes, well, what is the self then when it's not maintained? What is the thing happening that keeps us alive at the fundamental level, why our brain continues to think, and why we can be in a flow state while our self is not there? And so that becomes a very interesting question.
I would add to these interesting questions is how complex can be your life while your ego is dissolved. Because if you think of DMT and different other drugs, you're not doing anything complicated. If you're in a club, your main purpose is to dance.
Sure.
So that's quite automatic, I would say. So, but what people can think, I guess, if they're quite if their brains are as inventive and paranoid as mine, what if someone makes a drug that makes you into a zombie and you kind of work without questioning anything? Sounds very Orwellian if you think of that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So, I mean, are there any indications of like how extensive can your life be if you are not questioning anything?
Well, I guess then you could go the opposite direction. So instead of a forced shutdown of the default mode network through pharmaceuticals, you could go the opposite direction and do a learned shutdown of the DMN, which would be monks or meditators. So then in that regard, the same thing has essentially happened. Their DMNs are incredibly quiet when you measure their EEGs. And so they've actually learned to disassociate in some way. And through apparently what the paper points to is this recursive mechanism, you can actually reshape the signals that fire over time and dissolve them. And so as far as we can tell, the idea here is that like an advanced method, like let's just say like a Tibetan monk or something who is experiencing, enlightenment, would in theory have learned to entirely shut off the default mode network and let the lower, more fundamental processing be experienced without the filtration device, which is essentially, or the compression device, you may say, which is the default mode network. So in that regard, they're experiencing pure consciousness without the interference of this boundary, which is ourself. And so that would be the opposite case where, yeah, you get to see the opposite effect, but it's actually through the basically the decision or the pursuit of releasing and letting go. And
as far as I know,
it's
mainly about like letting go of your thoughts and letting them flow freely. So it's not allowing your thoughts to stick to you.
Yes, which then that's quite interesting because now again, like this is the idea here is that any thought you have, any conscious thought you have, is the default mode network at work. So you can't have a conscious thought without the default mode network. So then
that is crazy, yeah.
So then,
I wanted to ask you how it actually works, just so we make a little dip into the pragmatic questions. How these modes work, as you said, where it's stored, the information is stored, and what actually happens with this electromagnetic field versus calcium pathways.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So this would be the idea here is that at the highest levels, you have the default mode network, and also there's a level above the default mode network that kind of basically it tells the default mode network if it's time to like be alert or if it's time to calm down. And so it's actually the modulator of the modulator in that regard. So it's the LCNE system, and that system is essentially in a conversation with the DMN at all times. Like, hey, is now the time for us to fire off the referential thinking and think about all these things? Or is it time to shut down and like just act? And so there's this trade-off going on here. But this would be the idea of the brain in general, and we'll kind of get back to this later probably, is that it is a recursive system and it modulates itself because the default mode network over time is also like establishing goals for itself. It's creating like, you as an individual have goals and hopes and dreams. So the question is, then this gets into free will and what free will is and whatnot. And we can probably touch on that, I'm sure, at some point.
Yeah. It's a swamp. It's a swamp.
Oh, it is a swamp.
Well, to say so, just in case people are listening without prior Wikipedia surfing,
yes,
a default network is the parts of the brain involved in these processes, as far as I remember. So it's something in the frontal lobe, in the back of your head.
It's all the way front to back. So there's like basically a front area, a middle area, and a back area. And without getting too technical, that would be just kind of the idea here. The prefrontal lobe essentially is most correlated with the self-referential processing and the long-term planning aspects, and then there's the other parts are more associated with like metacognitive thinking and long-term goal planning and integration of memory into the self is a way to put it, but that's for another day. Long story short is that the default mode network is indeed the network, which is basically 3 or 4 areas of the brain most associated with the sense of self, the sense of self-referential thinking, your self-narrative, long-term planning, literally your entire sense of self, and in your entire action of being and thinking would be the default mode network, which would be normally associated with waking consciousness for the average person. The voice in your head, the person that the self-critical voice in your head, that's also the default mode network operating. That would be the ego inside of which is a part of the default mode network in that regard, which is why when the default mode network shuts off, ego dissolution happens. And so that's the high level here. Then the question becomes, well, then what are the lower levels? Like what happens when the default mode network shuts down? So that's what the paper gets into, because the default mode network is the most energy expensive system the brain operates. So that becomes very important. So Carhart-Harris found that certain parts of the DMN operated 40% above the baseline for the brain. And the brain only has approximately 20 watts of energy to work with at any given time. but only 10, 25, you may say, but only 10% of that is used for informational processing. So you have 2.5 watts to work with, which is literally like a light bulb, one light bulb. So one light bulb outcompetes like, potentially like supercomputers in chess for like 3 decades until the last, 15, 20, 30, I guess,
right.
since Gary Kasparov, right? But so that itself is pretty important for the energy budget. But the question then becomes is, well, what happens when the default mode network shuts off? Well, that's a lot of energy that gets freed up. So that's kind of where the mechanism and the idea starts coming in here is that, well, the brain has these different modes of operating. It has whatever a flow state is. Flow states are one thing. And then whatever is your waking normal consciousness when flow states aren't happening is a different thing. Mm-hmm. So these are 2 different modes happening. And so in cognitive science, this is known as system 1 and system 2. System 1 is the flow state stuff, the instant fast thinking. And then system 2 is logical, procedural, language, mathematics, anything that requires sequential reasoning. And so then the question is, well, there's clearly some sort of switch going on here between system 1 and system 2, or flow and not flow. So then the question becomes, well, what is happening at the lower levels? And the hypothesis would be is it has something to do with the energy exchange, because the default mode network is so expensive. So when it turns off, it enables a higher resolution mode of thinking, you may say, a mode of thinking that is faster, that processes more information, that makes reality feel more vivid, more alive, and more present than it does in waking consciousness. So
it kind of sounds like that, but do we actually see that this energy gets released in a sense? If you shut down an electrical station, I guess it's you can just shut it down and store energy somewhere. So that would be present. Or how is that? How can you get an insight in the electrical circuits of your brain like this?
Well, yeah. So the idea here is that you have to essentially infer based off of where energy is moving. So like, while you said, yeah, you can't just like put an energy gauge on microtubules inside of cells, so you have to do calculations on the requirements for systems based off of how much information is wrapped up in each system, which at this point is very well known. So, while I'm not a biophysicist, my collaborator, Jack Kaczynski, is. So I'm very lucky to be working with Jack Kaczynski. Yep. And so his whole career has been built on biophysics and the quantum properties inside of cells. And so he has done extensive calculation on the energy requirements for these processes and what they would require and what is already known in science versus what is still hypothesized. And so the work that he does is he shows that there's a certain level at which energy is required to maintain quantum processes at the smallest scales, at nanometer scales in the brain, which is essentially inside cells, which are microtubules are inside cells, and then inside microtubules. So at those scales is nanometer scales, which then you're talking like between 7 to 12 nanometers is like the width of a microtubule. And then quantum properties that's basically the quantum regime of physics, because at those levels, wave functions of electrons span about 4 nanometers. So in that regard, then the wave function of an electron can then overlap with all the other wave functions of all the other electrons in that area. And that can create for what they call superradiant quantum states, which is where they actually operate collectively as one. And so that allows for superpositions to occur in which information can be transferred what would be outside of normal time, essentially, which is why it manifests as incredibly fast outside of classical physics. And so all that to say is that this is why the energy is so important, because you have to have a certain level of energy pumping at these scales to maintain quantum processes against diffusion. If you pump for example, at these scales, because they're so small, they are actually pumping per square meter, this more energy than a lightning strike hitting the earth. There's more energy in a square meter inside the cytoskeleton because it's so small.
and yet we don't glow.
I know, right? What the hell?
I can glow with excitement, I guess. It's so interesting, this super glow that you can get from some molecules. I forgot which specific one, but one of those molecules of neurotransmitters that is capable of that is
Tryptophan.
shown to glow, and you can you can see how it starts to illuminate the whole thing.
Yes,
I was wondering. So in this mode, processing of information, does it mean that basically all the waves align and some sort of information can pass as if it was our internal Wi-Fi?
Okay. Yeah.
So packages of information, sort of.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll unpack that a little bit here too. So I'm gonna wrap back to the mechanism real quick, and then I'll answer that. Okay. So for the mechanism, the question is what connects the default mode network up, which is way up here. I mean, that's, scale wise, like 10. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, like 20 degrees, 20 orders of magnitude bigger than, the cells or inside cells. And so you're dealing with massive magnitude differences here. And so the question is, well, how does it scale down, up and down? And the beauty of it is that each level of the cell is firing energy at a certain frequency. And these frequencies can oscillate together. And what we've seen is that they line up actually very well, basically every 3 degrees or every 3 like levels. So you'd be like 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21. And they oscillate in these phase alignments of 3s. And so that can enable for information to transfer between levels through electromagnetic signal, but also through biophysical signals that are slower. So this is the idea in the paper, is that you have a fast electromagnetic environment and a slower biophysical environment that is the energy transfer happening at both scales. And so you can have faster boundary conditions that constrain the search space, but then you have slower ones that maintain memory and longer term order in the cells themselves. And so they work together to do that. And so there's a trade-off between fast information and slow information that then find an equilibrium at the cytoskeleton level. So then, and that's through, the default mode network, which is through neurons, and then you're going now inside of neurons into the cells. And so these are happening through different biophysical pathways, generally calcium phosphorylation, which calcium is one of the most important molecules for energy transfer. And it acts basically as like a system that kind of stores energy. And you can also potentially, this is what Jack and I's work is moving towards in the future. It's about how one stores information in the molecules between the lipid membranes and the cell themselves. And so basically, in theory, you should be able to store information. Are you at all familiar with holography as a practice when it comes to storing information in 3D information in 2D lattices?
Well, with holograms, pretty much.
Yeah,
but,
holograms.
For the lay people, I think would it be something like those crystals with your family photo inside of it?
Yes, and you can look and you can kind of shift them, and it makes it look fully 3-dimensional, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be the idea here, is that, well, how in the world does that technology work? Well, it uses a really specific type of laser technology that encodes information into a lattice with a certain frequency of reference beam. And if you have that certain frequency, you can shoot a reference beam into that lattice that recovers the information, but you can see it in the lattice without having to have the real thing there. And so it's storing information in that regard. So then the question is, well, how do you retrieve it? Well, you have to shoot energy beam with the same or a similar frequency with a similar informational characteristic, you may say, that can retrieve a lot of the same information back. And so
You mean you're poking with a laser
Yeah.
in case there is some information actually stored there? So the laser can
Yes.
return, there's nothing, or there was something, there was a connection.
Well, so
before.
then the idea would be is that this would be the idea is why memory is distributed across the entire brain, because holography stores information across the entire lattice, and then reference beams can actually so like, for example, if you store a picture of a hologram, you can cut out a puny little picture and then look through the peephole and see the entire picture through the peephole. So the idea here would be is like in your life, I mean, I think anyone has a memory like this where like you can basically like even smell the smells of the memory that you are thinking of. You can smell the smells. You can recreate the entire thing. I might say one word. I might say playground. And then you can picture as a kid being on a playground, and then something happens, maybe even the smell of it or like an emotion about it. Like you are picturing a massive high resolution scene from me saying the word playground. So
I totally feel that when I smell fresh varnish on wood, it makes me instantly think of Warcraft 3. Immediately.
Dude, yes. So that's exactly, and like I have this a lot because I have very much a tendency to play Minecraft while listening to podcasts. Okay, so I love playing, like, because it's so easy to like listen to the podcast while playing Minecraft, right? And so for me, when I think about things I've learned from podcasts, I can picture exactly where I was in a Minecraft map. Like I can literally visualize exactly where I was when I learned this thing from a podcast. And so the idea here is that your brain is encoding the entire sensory landscape of that moment into the lattice. And because it's such a unique moment, it has a unique informational code to it, you may say. And so in that regard, then it actually encodes very specifically and becomes easier to recall later because you're in a very unique environment, which would point to the idea for why you could remember like a vacation you took or the one time you were in that one place, but it's harder to remember what you had for breakfast 4 days ago or 6 days ago because it's the same place, the same environment, the same thing. And so it's less unique and therefore harder to replicate because the reference beam is so whitewashed with all this random noise.
Yeah. Is the workings behind the technique of putting labels on objects in your room if you're learning a different language probably working better than Duolingo? I studied with a lot of people studying Asian languages of sorts, so we had sort of a Wikipedia and Wiki dictionary entry on every object in the room.
And like that's really interesting because then it's encoding the word with the sensory environment you're in.
Yeah.
And now suddenly it has a whole new meaning to your mind.
Mm-hmm. It's connected
brilliant.
to the movement that you that you perform when you're pouring yourself some tea and stuff.
Yes.
And then this word reoccurs in your brain, and that actually helps. I actually worked with that. It works.
That totally makes sense. And so like from this perspective, again, like this is where, you know, Jack and I's work somewhat disagrees with traditional memory. Because like right now, memory is kind of thought to be like an encoding between neurons. But our work points to the fact that it's more distributed across the entire brain through essentially every cell. And that essentially every cell to some degree may store some part of almost every memory. And so then it depends on the environments you're in, the cues that you're currently operating with about what information gets recalled at a given time. And so this would be the idea for why a certain thing can trigger a massive reconstruction of such a vivid memory. So then you could picture like why PTSD, for example, would be so vivid for people because it's you'd be experiencing something that you never would ever expect to experience. And then it's such a vivid, emotional, horrific event that it's so overwhelming with so much information that the brain's like, I need to remember this, or almost like this is so unique and so insane that it's going to encode across a massive amount of brain space, essentially. And so in that
Yeah, all
regard,
sort of exposure therapy replaces these memories with a different
yes,
image. And if you experience the same story in a less in
a
a
less threatening
non-hostile
environment.
environment, that
Yes.
works.
Yes, exactly. So that would be exactly the reason why. So, from a phenomenological perspective, the underlying first principles of the framework make a lot of sense. So then the question is whether the science, potentially aligns. But I think from that perspective, it helps to kind of see what the framework's trying to say here is that while what matters here is the energy that shoots into the cells and into the cytoskeletons, because those are the things that end up, because energy is information. There's no difference here. And so this is what I was trying to get at with your original question was, well, what is the information itself? Well, the idea here, and we know this in from physics, is that information is phase encoded patterns of energy. So what phase is just a dimension of information, and phase itself is like in mathematics, for example. In traditional mathematics, you have like in a line from 1 to -1. There's 1, 0, -1. It's a line. But then in mathematics, you have these stupid things called imaginary numbers. And imaginary numbers
Imagine them.
suck because then you have -I and I. And what the hell is an imaginary number? And so in high school, that pissed me off. I'm like, how the hell can you have an imaginary number? That is ridiculous. You're telling me that there's a thing called I and it matters in math. Why would that matter? Well, the idea here is because to have a full reconstruction of anything. So not only do you have this, you don't have just this. This is just a line, but you need the full dimensional aspect of the thing to have all the information. So you need 3D, right? And so the idea here is that this is 1, 0, -1, but then this is I, 0, -I. So now you have 2 dimensions. And then now you'd get one more dimension by flipping it this way. And now suddenly you have what would end up being sine, cosine, and tangent. And those 3 things are what are encoding information at those scales. And so that itself is quite interesting in what information actually is, because that's encoded and embedded in what energy is, which is E equals HF, which is literally just encoded phase information. So the idea here is, without getting more technical than we have to be, the idea here is that information and energy are inseparable. They are the same thing, and all information is carrying energy, but it depends on how the system is evolved to use it. So you could think of it just as energy, but the reality is the energy is carrying a frequency, and the frequency is itself information. And so
I was thinking, I was trying to picture that in my head. When you're talking about the energy that sort of resonates with different microtubules inside the cells, inside the brain. Or at least this is how I understand it. I'm thinking of a massive orchestra that is orchestrated by just the influx of energy, and then this sound propagates through different sound crystals, or the strings, so to speak, that resonate or don't resonate, depending on whether the frequency of the original energy of the sound, so to speak, is of the right properties. If the main tube in this orchestra plays B or plays E, everything that is somehow in proportionate to E or B starts resonating with that. So whatever is the major chord to that, and this is how I try to explain to myself this quantum idea of this energy exchange, so to speak. Does it go in the right direction?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think That's a really good way to think about it. The thought would be is that microtubules, and inside microtubules, so like this would be tryptophan. So microtubules are like literally little cylinders. So like they're like this. They're just like tubes like that, essentially. And they kind of spiral like this. And they are made of two types of tubulins. And again, they're like 7 to 12 nanometers or so. And so their wave functions all overlap. And so their energy, if oscillating together, if harmonizing, if all aligned, would harmonize with surrounding tryptophan. And so the idea here is what you're saying is that if they're pumped with energy, so if energy hits them, it aligns them in a way in which they're able to efficiently transfer information. And that would be akin to being in harmony, that mathematically they're phase aligning. And that's, again, phase alignment is literally what sound is. So like if two violins start playing C at the same time, it sounds great. Or like a harmony, playing a harmony, it sounds good to us because it's a phase alignment. Like counting in steps is 1 is a phase alignment with 2, but if you have 1.63, it's not, it doesn't overlap well, but 1 and 2 overlap very well. And so in that regard,
this golden ratio almost happening over there. When I think the best intervals that sound the best to us, or like the most melodic intervals, they actually proportional. They can be included in one another. So I kind of thought of that. So tryptophan makes a string. That we can be sure of. So
yes.
It produces a mathematical string for this mathematical orchestra.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And so then this is the idea here is that people often think of energy as energy equals, so like generally it's taught as energy equals frequency. But the equation is E equals HF. So that was Max Planck in 1900 came up with that. He found this thing called H, which he called Planck's constant. And then, of course, Einstein in 1905, or I guess, into the 1910s, found general relativity, and that's E equals mc squared. So we know that energy equals HF, and we also know that energy equals mc squared. But that also means that we know something, which is that we know that mc squared equals HF. Okay, so this gets very strange, though, because generally it's taught that energy is frequency and H is a conversion factor. So this, when I originally set out with this whole book and the paper, I didn't really realize I was headed this direction, but it took us this direction basically through Jack and I's discussions about the quantum physics side of things. What is decoherence? What is the collapse of the wave function? What does this look like in a system like the brain or in a cell? And what we kind of, there was a big aha moment for me in there was in this research between decoherence theory and how a state, this is kind of the idea that the state goes from superposition to a collapsed state through this process of decoherence, which is losing its superposition, going from what would be 0 to either 1 or -1. So it goes towards one of the two poles. And it goes potentially progressively from 0 to 1 or 0 to -1. And then when it officially reaches -1 or 1, that's called collapse. And in between is decoherence. And then this is the idea is that decoherence creates phase alignment problems, because if you're decohering, you're not at 0 anymore. You're in between, and it creates problems. This is why quantum computers need to maintain incredibly cold, cool, isolated temperatures with no interference at all, because they all have to stay at 0. They all have to stay at superposition. But then what the work that we found was the big paper came out in 2020 from Chow et al. That there's been a big debate in quantum biology about how photosynthesis worked. And this was dating back to 2007 with this paper that basically said, hey, there's quantum processes in photosynthesis. And the whole the whole biology world was like, no, there isn't, like they're liar.
Tell me they do it before us.
Yeah. And then it took 13 years. And then finally, like 18 biologists from all over the world came together. And this paper in 2020 came out that said, here's the official answer. And they basically all agreed that nature does not maintain coherence. It actually has found a way to utilize decoherence. The mechanism for energy transfer itself is directed by decoherence. So the idea here is this would be the same thing. So imagine when water is at the top of a cup or whatever, and it has water tension, Yep. So the first drop that comes out, where does all the other water go? It follows the drop that came out. So like the idea here is that the system, when it starts to overflow, when you start to lose coherence, that is creating a path for energy to flow. So just like a river that flows downhill from a mountain, the first water drop that started the Grand Canyon or something, like the first water drop that started a river created a pathway for the river to continue going down that path. And so eventually the river was the path of least resistance, but it required the first drop of energy to start going in that direction. There at one point was the first drop of water that went down that direction to create the river. So the idea here is that evolution found the same system, was that the process of decoherence automatically finds the path of least resistance. So why wouldn't you utilize that? So because in quantum mechanics, there's a thing called Feynman's path integral, which, are you at all familiar with the path integral?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. This is fantastic. So in quantum mechanics, this was discovered in the 40s and then kind of wasn't fully understood in quantum mechanics till probably the 60s, was this thing called the path integral, which Richard Feynman found, which is his idea that it's generally described as particles, well, specifically photons, explore all possible paths. And then they pick the one that requires the least amount of energy. And so the least amount of energy is always prioritized. So the idea here is that the reason why we see light bending, or why, like, you look through a water glass and light is bending the fork or the straw that you put into the water, is because there's so much interference from the water that the light has to bend through the water. And that's how, when it reaches our eye, that's what we see. Okay. So the idea here is that because of the interference, it creates a certain path. And that path is the path of least resistance that we see. In the same exact way for why a water flows in a river, it's because that's the path of least resistance down the mountain. The exact same thing is happening with energy. It follows the path of least resistance. So then what Chow and all found was that, well, biology, why wouldn't it utilize this? Of course it does. That's what evolution does, is it finds the way to do the most with the least. And so it found that decoherence was the point. And so, well, what does that mean for the brain and how energy transfers? Well, that means that you actually need some level of decoherence, some level of interference, some level of something that gets in the way to cause the energy to flow in one direction. So inside microtubules, as long as you maintain a certain amount of energy pumping, then coherent states can last long enough for a lot of cycles of coherence to occur before they get decohered away. So there's a certain amount, the energy pumping happens at a certain frequency. So like, let's just say it happens, energy pump, energy pump, energy pump. So every time it's pumped, you can maintain coherence. But in between the pumping, there's actually thermal noise, interference, trying to essentially attack the state. And so, well, my camera's auto-focusing on the background. What's up? And so basically, what's happening though is that the system has built in this process of losing the quantum state. Okay. And so that is actually used by the system to pick where energy should go. And it goes to the most optimal path, which is how energy transfers through the system. And it's been built to utilize this. So it's not like it decided to do it. It's because the original cells, which tryptophan and specifically microtubules are like some of the oldest systems in evolution. Like they're in single-celled organisms. And so the idea here would be, and anesthesia works on single-celled organisms. So one-cell organisms can get eliminated by anesthesia. And then when the anesthesia wears off...
So you can paralyze an amoeba for some time to
yes.
cut it. Finally, some humanity in this field of science.
Dude, amen, brother. Amen. Finally.
I'm thinking, wait a second. So do you mean that this kind of works as those lines in the airport that lead to the checks? So there's multiple checkpoints, and there's usually some person who's like, okay, you stay, now you can go. And they're passing this bits of humanity.
Sure.
Packages of humans because they always see these paths, and they can see where you can go, so to speak. So they are in a in an observant position, so to speak, because they know where to send you from experience, probably. Which raises a question that if technically our brain is organized evolution in an evolutionary manner as this sort of massive channels that were pre-carved by the evolution for the least resistance, for example. There's also some blocking of these channels. Then someone has to see where to open the gate, so to speak. Does this touch base with the whole hologram that we were talking about before, with observing the whole picture through a peephole? That's the stuff that you were talking about.
Sure. Yeah. Well, for what you're saying is that's a very analogous to what Feynman's path integral says. Like the idea here is that the universe itself operates in this least action principle, that the reason why stability exists is because things fall towards action, what they call action minima, stable configurations. And so mass itself, E equals mc squared, mass itself is stable configurations. So you could write it as E equals hf, or hf equals mc squared, which means that mass equals the frequencies of h divided by the speed of light squared. And so in that regard, mass is stable configurations that are updated at the speed of light of action frequencies, of h frequencies. And so in that regard, mass itself is a stable pattern that exists in space-time. So in that same sense, in our brains, any configuration we have, any energy that's stuck in a loop that's updating, like our memories clearly have some sort of configuration that's consistently updating and maintaining itself. Otherwise, it would dissipate into nothingness. Because any system that is not maintained by energy dissipates into nothingness. When we die, we stop maintaining the processes that hold us together, and we dissipate into nothingness. And so while we're alive, these energy processes are the things that maintain the boundaries between us, not just our ego and the rest, but our physical bodies and the rest. And so in that sense, this is why like there's really a blurry line here between what quantum physics is and what classical physics is. In general, people think of it as a very harsh line, but it's very much not. It's a very gradient line where the quantum mechanics get washed out at bigger scales because the math is so coarse-grained to our size of beings. But the reality is that if you keep zooming in, there's a level at which the quantum mechanics have to manifest. And the idea here is that any system organizes around this path of least resistance, aka the path of least action, which is why, but like we think of it like, well, how in the world did the system choose this? Well, it's not because but that's just the wrong question. The idea is that we exist because of that principle. So otherwise we would not exist, you know? And so in that sense, totally, our entire system is organized around maintaining the most optimal energy transfer possible, the most optimal system for organizing information, for organizing energy, in the same way that someone at the airport would be organizing people to try to prevent, problems in the system. So totally, I think it's essentially the same physics manifesting at different scales.
Yeah, as to to add to the system, what I found particularly feeding into this vision was the idea that calcium pathways sort of builds constraints for this flow in a way, and for the long-term restructuring of this free flow.
Yes.
And it all actually makes sense if you start thinking in this direction, because as far as I understand, there is some pre-wiring that is happening via chemical markers when the brain develops. So the axons are actually going in the right direction, not wherever they want to bind. It's actually some pre-wired path, so to speak. Then we have the principle of fire together, wire together, and that is pretty much the idea of a channel that is established later on, and to connect this free floating system and finally expel every marker of free will. We can say that we have some pre-wired pathways to establish first experiences. Why not just run on this fire together, wire together principle afterwards? Because in principle, this is how our reflexes end up in giving us the first impressions in life. We have a sucking reflex, and when we have our mom's breast for the first time, our brain just understands what to do with that automatically.
Mm-hmm. Just like every animal does. Yeah.
Yeah, and Freud made the whole science out of it for that matter. So you can totally see how the system would work without too much extra decision making. But then of course, as your paper also states, is very logical evolutionarily why we would still need to switch to the rational thinking, because it's our advantage about.
Yeah, exactly, right. So then that would be the question is, well, okay, sure. Well, why aren't we all just dogs? Why, like, dogs seem to have a great life. Why aren't we all just dogs? And the idea here would be is that the systems basically, I mean, if evolution is exploring so evolution in this sense, and I've been working on kind of like formulating this, but this is kind of like a well-known thought, is that the idea here is that evolution is sort of at a slower scale. Like if you can assume that a photon explores all possible paths instantly, you could think of the process of evolution as doing the exact same thing, but very slowly in relation. That it's exploring all possible physical paths to operate most optimally given the constraints that this system operates within. And so humans ended up being, at this point, the most optimal configuration fitting the natural and known universe in that regard so far, right? And so... with the
exception of COVID, I suppose. That stuff is too adapted.
Yeah, right. It's impossible to conquer. And so, like, in that regard, then, the question then becomes, well, like, humans, we exist. Well, why do we exist? And in that regard, as far as the best we can tell is because we have a competitive advantage. Well, what is the competitive advantage? The common question, people often ask, it's like, well, what makes humans unique? Excuse me. And the one answer I keep falling back to is, well, it's metacognition. It's the ability to see into the future, at least to predict the future. No other organism can do that to the extent that humans can. It's not even close. I mean, dogs can anticipate you coming home from work. But the question is at what degree of metacognition are they actually doing so?
Yeah, the Roman geese feel the barbarians somehow.
Yeah, exactly, right? But like humans, as far as we know, are essentially one of the only is potentially the only organism that can have all of its physical needs met and still suffer because of our model of the future versus what we are today. So it could be nothing about the present moment besides what the present moment is in relation to the future. Oh, I'm not where I should be today. Oh, I have a terrible dead-end job. Oh, I'm never going to do anything in life. You know, a dog's not having a
the Germans,
metaphysical...
they have Weltschmerz, the pain of the world. Wonderful coinage.
It's great. And so, yeah, like, you know, dogs aren't suffering about what type of dog they could or could not be, you know? And, you know, am I living my most optimal dog life? Like the dog's not sitting there suffering in that regard, wondering. And so but the same thing that plagues us humans is also the same thing that is the reason potentially, like, this is what I get into the book. In the book specifically, I talk a lot more about this, is that, well, like, it may be possible that the reason why humans are the only egoed animals that exist is because an ego itself is a monopoly. Like it looks for monopolies. It wants to be a monopoly. An ego itself is inherently monopolistic. Like, if there are other competitive egos, the human ego will say, let's eliminate that ego because that ego is a threat to us. So this would be the idea that any human-like species got eliminated by us because they were threatening before. And so the idea would be is that, well, why are humans the only ones that have consciousness in the way we have it? Well, maybe it's because we killed off every other one that could have possibly had it.
Wait a second. Interesting thing. I recently heard a theory that our ego relations were developing somehow, and that the voices that people heard at the onset of the human civilization were there were more revelations from God, so to speak, that we were seriously taking into account, and that was a path of listening to this ego, or like incorporating this internal voice into our system. And now I'm thinking of that. Can it be that we developed ego as a tool due to our huge sociality in comparison with other animals?
Yes.
It's not that we just have a pack. We have multiple packs, and we're aware of the other packs that are out there running around the savannah.
Yeah, right. So this would be the idea here then, is like, I mean, multiple incredibly interesting points there. I think the first one was the fact that the ego is counter-constructive to experiencing God. That is, I mean, again, straight back to what we started this conversation with, exactly the idea here is that it is plausible that Adam and Eve communed with God in the garden. I mean, the idea here is that if you have no ego, then perhaps you are indeed communing with God in the garden, whether, you know, at least metaphorically, right? At least metaphorically. And so then, to your point though, is like, someone whose research I really like is John Vervaeke, and he's been very interested in shamanism recently, as shamanism kind of being the evolutionary ancestor to all modern mysticism when it comes to, like, even something as simple as like meditation or alternative medicine or hypnosis or even something like there's so many, but like things along those trances, like meditative dance, anything along those lines, worship, like modern worship music. Like anything that puts you into sort of like an egoless state of sorts, flow states in general. Even the placebo effect in like medical science. The idea that if you believe that the doctor says this will make you better, it is relatively massively significant that actually matters. So now imagine that you're a tribesman, and the shaman, who is the authority on all things health, says this will make you better. Well, inherently, he is harnessing the power of whatever the placebo is, which we can get into that as well, because that's also quite interesting in the framework. But whatever the power of the placebo is, would be something the shaman was doing. So in that regard, the idea here would be is that the shaman, and also it's interesting because what was the shaman? The shaman he was someone who he didn't have to go hunt. He wasn't a hunter, but he also wasn't a caretaker. So he wasn't playing the role of the man or the woman in the traditional tribe, right? He was something in between because he didn't have to take care of the children, but he also didn't have to go out and hunt. So he was
that's a medium.
He's a medium. That's quite interesting, isn't it? And so in some regards, he was actually a medium in many tribes when it comes to our modern sense of a medium. He could speak with the ancestors in many tribes. And so this is the idea here is that the shaman was the ancestor to all things spiritual in that regard. But then the question is, well, it had to have served a purpose and it had to have worked. Otherwise, it wouldn't have existed. That's the whole idea. And everyone had shamans, including like up until the Middle Ages. I mean, kings had wise men or magicians up until like essentially, even some traditions into the past like 500 AD or so. So like there has to be some sort of purpose here. But what your point was is that the emergence of human ego as society and civilization developed, you saw the elimination of the shaman traditions. So then something was given up. So as the ego emerged, the spiritual was almost given up in some regard. And that's quite interesting, I think.
I think to an extent, yeah, I can. It's part of a question, but you're going further. I thought I was thinking purely of the religious experiences, like, for example, our favorite Hildegard von Bingen.
Oh yeah,
this lady that had revelations, communes with God on a regular basis, created a lot of music for that matter, or the Revelation of John. I recently read it. It's an amazingly epic story, like the Apocalypse.
Interesting.
Absolutely beautiful. And these sort of things kind of don't really resurface in the newly established religions. We get the Book of Mormon, we get these sort of things, but there's way more conscience-based or rather reflexive doctrines. There's way more there's way more propaganda versus pure belief. And propaganda, if you think of that, is actually explaining things to you in a sense. It's trying to appeal to your ratio,
to appeal to your current ego. Yeah, in some sense. Yeah,
or to build your ego for that matter, because we also live in a very egoistic time of self-branding and construction in a very conscious sense. That is also interesting that on the one hand, we're building brands for ourselves and trying to make little factories out of our lives. But on the other hand, there's a craving for some faith, for some dissolution of this ego. That's why we have DMT retreats and that sort of stories. That's why Goa and Bali, the hotspots of overworked programmers from everywhere.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So there is you can probably trace some sort of evolution towards more rational thinking. That is maybe the project of the Enlightenment, if you think of that, that tried to rationalize a lot of the relations with God. For that matter, that's a whole story about Leibniz trying to figure out what sort of entities God could have created. He eventually converged on the fact that he agrees with himself that probably God created the things that are self-identical. So, which in his opinion is, well, a cat. What is a cat? A cat is a cat. That's as simple as that. So God would be responsible for that level of logic. That is 18th century, basically.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. We kind of going in this direction. I was wondering specifically also that probably our ego developed because we had to distinguish ourselves and others on a massive scale, where these connections actually have to be rationalized. Like in a family, for example, you have well, it's not too many people, and to an extent, you have roles. You can consider yourselves merged together in this unit. I don't know. We can go far with that, but what I mean is when humans start building a society, bigger society, there's a lot of pressure on actually making a mechanism that will tell you, okay, you can do that. That person cannot do that. Why cannot this person do that? Because the object that we're talking about, like this apple, doesn't belong to him. It's my apple. I won't give it to you. That's what I mean. Do you have this kind of feeling that ego develops through these interactions?
Okay, this is amazing. So in the book, okay, so this is, this was a bit more speculative, but it is this literature is already established to a degree in cognitive psychology or in developmental psychology. And these are specifically, how familiar are you with, have you ever heard of like the levels of consciousness, like field of research? So
on the surface level.
Okay. Yeah. So again, oftentimes the word levels, I think, bothers people, like as if it's like hierarchical, like, oh, I'm more enlightened than you or something. But I don't think that's exactly what it's saying. It's more about what you were saying is the relationship to one's ego. And so, and the relationship with the ego to the environment. Okay. And this scales with survival needs. And so, in the book, we actually tweak it a bit because the book, through the quantum mechanical process, identified beliefs as the fundamental thing in the brain. So I'm excited to talk about this because I haven't had a chance to talk about this yet because it's the book and not the paper. So the book kind of goes in the implication on the paper, but the book, the levels of the levels of consciousness itself are extremely interesting, and the book takes this interesting perspective on it through belief structure itself. And so the idea here is that everyone has a core identity and in a relationship to the world stemming from some very core belief, and the core beliefs would essentially you could think of as the core belief for each level as essentially the biggest gravity well in one's mind for their identity. And it's the biggest, the technical term is the biggest attractor basin, the biggest gravity well, the biggest cavity in the brain's energy well that creates a center of gravity for your sense of self. So when you answer, who am I? It'll reflect in some way this core belief. Okay. And so the levels of consciousness scale very, very closely with survival needs, especially at the earlier levels. And this would go back to your thought about the developmental trajectory with tribes and into society. So like the first one is I am my needs, because basically if you're a tribe, if you're pre-tribe even, what are you besides your hunger and your safety? You are your hunger and your safety. So in that regard, you can't actually extrapolate any higher than that. But then what emerges through social dynamics is I'm not just my needs. Then you can actually transition into this level where I am my power. I am my ability to harness my energy towards something. And that often would be then tribal warfare in that regard, or something like that. Survival, like I am my power in some regard. And then the next would be
you are your community at the same time. If you think of that,
yes,
I understand what you're talking about. It's actually probably why we could allow ourselves environmental thinking only on the very recent stages of development. Because if you take some sort of a medieval conquistador that is conquering nature, brute forcing troops through the jungle, those people are not concerned with the level of inclusion in the nature. They're not
No.
included in the nature. They're opposed to it. And this is sort of a different level that we unlock for ourselves when we can actually do something about it. Probably.
Yes,
When we
yes.
can choose what to use.
Right. So then that's also part of these levels, is that the level of agency increases with each level, because you disassociate from the pure signal and can abstract towards the future, towards the past, and integrate action to most optimally fit your environment. So like level 2 is like I am my power, which is then mostly about like, well, can you survive? It's very survival based. But then level 3 then becomes I am my tribe. And this is where you're kind of getting to this idea, what you were saying before is like, well, at what point do your needs go past the tribe? Like, is the deer you hunted yours? Well, no, it's not, because you are the tribe. So like at that point, it does not serve yourself to have a sense of I, because the survival, you hope that everyone thinks that they are the tribe. Because if they all think they're the tribe, you're all going to benefit when the deer is hunted or when the animal is hunted, because you're going to get the food too. So it doesn't actually help you to have any level of individuation or any level of sense of self further than that, because then if you become the guy who's like, does Jerry really deserve the deer? You know, like, I don't think Jerry deserves the deer. Like, then that's a problem, you know?
Exactly. Well, who are you? That's my lump of meat. You know, I think on that matter, there was a wonderful observation that opened up a whole abyss of thoughts for me. Historically, if you think of that, probably there could be some counter arguments, but mainly the ethnical groups in Europe that remained pagan were eventually conquered by whoever applied Christianity or some other religion for that matter. But taking on uniform religion was actually explaining people to the people how. Why we are together? What we have to share with those tribes?
You're nailing this. You're nailing this. So guess this:
the Prussians were pagan. They were incorporated by the Germanic population that was baptized. And there's a bunch of Balto-Slavic ethnicities that remained pagan. They were eventually incorporated into Poland, into Prussia, into Russia. These sort of entities.
Well, you can even think the same thing happened. The Aztecs had a religion. The Mayans had a religion. You know,
everyone and they did incorporate everyone else who didn't.
And they made sure you followed it. So like there is something to this. And so then you nailed this though, because your next thought was exactly this thing. What is the next level? Level 4 of consciousness would then be I am my roles. But roles are assigned by external authorities. And so what is the most powerful external authority to drive the most prescient action? Well, it's God. If your role is defined by God, well then why you're going to go to every extent possible to fulfill your role, your duty. So that's even more powerful than being I am my tribe, because now you can differentiate. You can say, "Oh, I'm a blacksmith, but this is deemed by God to be a blacksmith. So now I'm going to do the best I can possibly be to be a blacksmith because it's my duty in life." Or like, you know, my role is I'm a priest. Well, I'm going to be a priest, and that's not defined by me. I'm not the one defining the role. God defines the roles. The authorities define the roles. And so, but that's really powerful. And that allows for you to specialize. And that, I mean, this is like, you know, manufacturing is a technology because it specializes. And specialization itself is what creates modern civilization, to harness energy and be more efficient. And the more people you have in a society, you need roles to organize society. And so it's no surprise that, you know, religious fervency creates a sort of ability to harness people and organize them into a more effective ways, and then win wars because of it. So like whether it's, you know, this is outside of whether religion is correct or right, or if there's a God. The reality of the fact is that it is a legitimate technology for survival, and that is most definitely shown as exactly what you were saying.
Yeah. I think it's also creating shortcuts for your for your reflections about what to do in life and how to choose your path, because it's providing you a certain mold that you can fit in a way. And this is also why we see the dissolution of classical religious fundamentalism, probably at the onset of the Industrial Revolution, because when the roles become too fragmented, and it's impossible to keep up with that on a religious level, you know?
Okay, so now this is very interesting. Okay, wow. So the next level 5 is I am my actions and achievements. So you are actually transcending the role that is assigned to you by a higher power. And then you're saying, actually, wait a second, I can define my own success through my own actions. I don't need to be defined by whether I'm a good teacher or pastor or priest or, blacksmith by some other person, by God or by the government. I can make my own rules for how good I am and do my own thing. So that has its own power, because if everyone, this is where the emergence of modern economics starts to play out, because if everyone acts in their own self-interest, it does create an equilibrium. Because if you know that everyone's acting, it's a game theory, and it's the invisible hand in economics, that if everyone acts in their own self-interest, well, it works out. But this is what developmental research shows, that out of modern Americans, the vast majority of people are level 4, 5, and 6. So about 85% of people are between levels 4, 5, and 6. And about 25% or so are level 5. 18 or so percent is level 4, and the rest are level 6. But to your point about the 1900s was, I think this is, when you said that, I was like, oh, wait a second, this is very interesting, because level 4 is I am my roles and achievements. But level 4 is I am my roles. But that could be defined by God. But the key is it's defined by a higher power. So, well, what happens if you replace God with the state? And that's exactly what Hegel and Rousseau were trying to do with essentially with Germany, and what manifested as fascism was replacing God with the state. Well, you don't need God to tell you what to do.
Totalitarian power altogether, I think. It's not just about Germany.
And then it happened in Russia.
Itself. Yeah, it happened. Stalinism is very much similar to that. Maoism is very similar to that.
So it's just totalitarianism in general.
Some replacement of a god with some person or personified state, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So then the idea, because like that, so how I see it is that like Friedrich Nietzsche really channels this individuation, this will to power, is like this, well, maximize yourself. And that's kind of like this level 5. And Nietzsche's biggest criticisms were often against the Christianity. He called it the religion of slave mentality. And he said that people who have faith are weak. They just want to be told what to do. They're lambs. They're people who just want to get told what to do by their shepherd. They don't care to have an opinion on their own. And that was Nietzsche's big criticism of Christianity, which, to be fair, I think he missed the point. But it is a legitimate criticism of a certain perspective on it, though, and a certain manifestation of what it can be. And Nietzsche predicted that, God is dead. Well, when God dies, well, what replaces God? And he said the state will replace God, and he nailed that. That's exactly what happened. The state replaced God, and then we saw what happened in the 1900s when the state replaces God. So then,
but also consider that it's so interesting. I think that it's also a reflection of hierarchical thinking that came from way back from the medieval era of strict hierarchies, and it still survived to an extent. It still survives in our hierarchies of the companies. Still, to an extent, we have a CEO who is sort of an overlord without power, but a kind of a convergence point, like an apex predator in the company, or like sort of like a jade emperor in Chinese mentality.
Roman emperors in that regard.
Yeah. And this is where technology of religion or technology of understanding reality converges with the experience of living with just technology. That is interesting, probably to see how what's it called? Ground collaboration, this sort of horizontal structures getting more and more talked about in the past maybe 20 years or so, something like that. Because the understanding of yourself as a cognate system to an extent sort of puts the whole humanity in a lot of in a toolbox. There's a lot of cogs and nuts and little bits and pieces. They are presented to you in the same palette. So if you think, okay, what am I gonna be doing when I graduate? You imagine it as a field of uniform possibilities, so to speak. And that's our experience of life that can transform into the ways we organize ourselves, that can transform into new religions. And that's actually a question, where are we going to go when we completely forego of this hierarchical image of the world organization. There's no one telling you what to do anymore. There's a bunch of influencers, your bubbles, and that sort of stuff. There is no, what people say, how Zizek calls it, there is no main. There is no main idea. There's no main
unifying
signifier that exists for us all as God or the state or anything. There's just an eternal choosing process, which already works since, I think, the Cyborg Manifesto, more or less. And already worn itself out a little bit, now turned into looks-maxing and everything. So we have to go to a next level of some sort. And probably what I mean is that is going to be directed by the ways we organize ourselves in life, by the ways we work.
Okay, so your ability to transition to the next level of consciousness is genuinely incredible. So the next level of consciousness is level 6. So level 5 was, level 4 was I am my roles, and defined by a higher authority, and you find purpose in fulfilling that duty. Then level 5 is you find purpose in not fulfilling the duty, but in performing your best, in being the best version of whatever you are now. And you look to achieve and you look to build status. And that's the most common current approach to life, even in modern day. And then level 6 is actually just about to overtake level 5 as the most common level of consciousness and again, I don't really love the word level because it assumes hierarchical per se. It's just that it's a different orientation to the self. And so I would say it's sort of hierarchical, but I would picture it more like a journey than like a level, It's like, I would think of it more like a adventure. But
more like a consistency measure, because I remembered that Deleuze had, for example, that concentric schematic of these levels, and explain the case of the crazy judge that Freud writes about in terms of jumping between the levels. And that is what was the trait of his schizophrenia, that he would say things like, it was a very anti-Semitic judge, for that matter, late 19th century Germany, I beg your pardon.
Surprise.
He was like, my stomach is killing me because it's Jewish. So it's like, okay.
Wow. Yeah.
And then so he jumps from the bodily level of consistency of thought to the ethnic level, and the same thought, the same thought covers 2 levels, and for that matter, it's inconsistent. Like it doesn't make sense because it jumped between them. That's what I would say.
That's very interesting, because so then the next level or the next stage is, you go from I am my actions in my achievements. So this maxing of the individual, to then you start to question, well, what am I maxing here? So like it turns inwards. It says, who am I and why am I doing what I'm doing? So you start to ask, well, why do I even do what I do? is this the game I even want to play? What games could I play and I'm using game in the most broad sense, like job, career, whatever, right?
Absolutely.
And so then from there, you start to ask, well, this is kind of like an open world game. Well, who am I? What are my values? What is my purpose? And so then this next orientation of yourself is around your values and purpose. It's who am I? What do I value? And what am I called to do, or what is my purpose because of who I am? And that is kind of the next stage. And then the stage can evolve after that. But I think that's an interesting place to get to for modern times, because this is, I think, where a lot of people are finding themselves right now. And I think, in my opinion, I'm wondering if COVID was kind of a bit of a turning point there, where people were like, because it put the world on pause. And for the first time in a long time, people had to question, what am I doing with my life? And I think a large percentage of people had, for the first time, had a few weeks to actually ask that question and legitimately wonder. And so I do wonder if that was a significant shift for humanity that will be looked back on as potentially this like new era for humans' orientation to itself at large.
Most certainly. If you turn back to the plague times, they opened up the story of religious wars, and that can be also due to some turning point in the mentality. It's like all this feeling of mortality, of this evanescent world that's disappearing in one instance, and there's nothing to explain it.
Yeah.
And here it was also sort of a presence of massive power on top of all the reflections about what am I doing in my square meters. Because when you cannot leave your space, I think you in America, that's a really different story because of different households. But in my Moscow household, I was pacing the perimeter of 40 square meters all the time, thinking to myself, it's like a cage. It is. It's sort of a cage.
Yeah. Right. And that forces you to ask questions. I mean, what else are you going to do besides ask questions, right? And so I really think that was, because again, like just in the research that I was looking at, when the people who study these levels of consciousness, it's not a huge field, but like it's a subfield of developmental psychology. And in the late 2000s, it was pointing to the fact that this level 6 of values and purpose was just about to pass level 5. So I don't think there's new data on this yet, but I would have to assume that catalyzed probably the significant shift for the population to now being the majority of, at least this study was Americans, so I can only statistically talk about Americans, but statistically, at least you could probably assume the West at large then would be around those similar percentiles. And in that regard, that then this orientation to the self is values and purpose. So then what does that mean for how we are as people? And again, like this, I maybe I want to wrap it back to the framework here, or like the biophysics a bit here, because you might ask, well, how in the world did the beliefs work? And so this comes from the field of quantum cognition, which is modeling the brain through quantum statistics. And this is what the intro of our switching paper talked at length about, because they showed that beliefs operate as constraints on the environmental space, and that a belief that you have is all beliefs. This is interesting because I'm sure you've heard the term a limiting belief.
Absolutely. Well, to an extent, I think all beliefs are limiting because it's a constraint on what is true and what is false.
Yes, exactly. So that's what in the quantum cognition research they were showing, is that it doesn't matter if the belief is a negative belief, which is, again, completely arbitrary to your belief system, or a positive belief, is that both are beliefs. And if you believe yes, you have to also believe the no. So if I say, is chocolate the best? Is chocolate ice cream the best type of ice cream? And if you say yes, well, then you're also saying that vanilla ice cream is not the best ice cream, And so you are saying that's multiple beliefs wrapped into one. you know? And so anytime you say yes, the no's are also beliefs themselves, okay? And so anyway, the idea here is that you're paying a thermodynamic cost for these beliefs in your brain. So the idea here is, again, the brain is an open energy system, and you have to pay the price for those beliefs. So this is your idea here is then, well, what is an informational landscape? What is energy? What is information? Well, it's energy, and beliefs are maintained patterns of energy, maintained phase structures of energy. And so the idea here is that any belief you have is limiting your search space. So then think about, well, if your identity, this is the idea here is that the search space grows as your identity, as the identity levels or the levels of consciousness shift, because you're expanding your search space. Before, for example, your roles, you were limited by the defined roles as defined by authorities, but that defines a very specific lane of action. Like you said, it provides a lot of stability for you. And that's the advantage, is that it provides a lot of stability for how you should act, how you should think. You don't have to go out and explore the unknown because you have a set way of being. And then level 5 is, well, yeah, you know, like now you can explore, well, I am this person. So now I'm going to explore all the ways to best be this person, my actions and my achievements as who I am. Boom. But you're not questioning the who I am. Then at level 6, this next level is, well, who am I? And then now it creates a lot more instability. So this is what you're saying is like, it's not as optimal in a survival situation. You don't want the guy who's trying to hunt the deer for your tribe to ask, well, really, who am I right now? Like, is it really worth me to like spend all this energy to like hunt the deer? It's like, I'll pass. You know, you don't want him to question who he is. But in modern society, we have the luxury, because we don't have to worry about where our next meal is and whatnot. Those things we can question. And that creates for a massive search space of possibility. Not only are your actions unlimited, but your potentially your orientation of yourself is unlimited. Who am I at large? Well, that's a huge question. So the idea here is that you're actually, throughout this process, you're dissolving beliefs about the world and your relationship to the world. And that enables you to explore a large search space. And that's again, rooted in the energy and the physics at the most fundamental level inside cells. So that was kind of, I was hoping to maybe connect that there, because it was maybe getting a little bit abstract. Hopefully that maybe helps a little bit. So now we're at level 6 here. And what comes to mind for you?
Yeah. I'm thinking that is very... that's remarkable that the biggest amount of musing about the sense of life comes from, and philosophy of that sort, comes from some people at court in medieval ages, or like in a monastery where they don't have to worry, for that matter, about certain things that other parts of the population have to worry about. So you still have some mental space. For the monks, probably it's also because there's a tendency to there's a promotion of this exploration, which does not exist for that matter for peasant population. For the people at court, that exists in the form of free food and free energy that can be spent on that. So it's kind of always intimately connected to the activities that we do. I think I'm very practically Marxist in this idea. Also thinking about our contemporary times, which are interesting. It's baffling how much possibility we have. But and that's probably why this is packaged so well in the idea of a bubble. I think a bubble is this buzzword of contemporary 10 years, maybe. It's like a decade thing. Where's your bubble? Where's your circle? I think it used to be called a circle before that. But in any case, it's about encapsulating yourself from this whole field of possibilities, which just reduces the amount of confusion to an extent. What works for you, what doesn't work for you. The problem is that some of the bubbles can be purely imaginary nowadays, because you can imagine yourself a sheikh, or you can imagine yourself heir to massive wealth of some company, but you are not. Then a lot of those possibilities exist for you in the sort of imaginary, never reachable state, which can be a cause of contemporary. Would it be? It's like a sort of a philosophical dysphoria, philosophical confusion. I don't know. I personally believe. I believe that one has to enjoy poetry, one has to make art, and when I count all the things that I think make life worthwhile, I realize I need a massive bank account for that. And I probably don't have.
Yeah, right. Well, so that's interesting though, because like one thing that's interesting in the levels of consciousness research is that you would think that happiness would be correlated, but it's entirely uncorrelated, that there is no increase in happiness between levels of consciousness. So then you have to ask, well, then like, why are there levels of consciousness? Because, you know, if humans aren't finding extra happiness on average, throughout their different levels of consciousness, then why do they exist? And to me, it's interesting because, like, you know, inherently you would think, oh, well, if you're searching a larger search space, if you have more individual power or more individual, agency, you're going to inherently be more happy. But as far as the levels of consciousness research shows, that's just not the case. People are very, I mean, and you know this. I mean, like, you know, what's the average grandma is so happy and they're not contemplating, you know, the meaning of themselves. Like the average grandma is a very happy person who is so content and so loving of the world and would say their life is amazing. And it's not like they're sitting there contemplating, well, who am I today? Like, what is this self? And like, what are my goals and purpose? And like, why am I who I am? You know?
And they're definitely not counting the amount of grandkids they do sometimes.
They do sometimes.
But but kids maxing is not is quite alien to contemporary grandmas. Maybe, you know, in some years.
Yeah, honestly though, maybe so. Yeah, at this point, that could be the case. The next frontier.
I thought about that. You said it's really really interesting stuff about the values and this drift. When we talk about that, what I mean, when we talk about that, sometimes we're thinking about the maximization of joy, or about a surplus being something inherently good. And I think this is among the things that will eventually bring us to a different level of consciousness, the reformation of this map of dependencies. Because what I mean, when you have a god or a tsar in your head, then you have someone who instructs. And that's not only someone who instructs as a position that's been there forever. It's also a configuration of logic, of sense making that emerged from the hierarchical structures of religious societies, medieval hierarchies, feudal societies, and that sort of stuff.
Right, which emerged from tribes, and they lost out to the ones who had more complex societies. So that goes back to our original conversation. Exactly.
And that develops as not like Freud would probably think of that as slots for particular mental capacities. And Deleuze would be like, come on, which kind of slots? The slots are in themselves created. And the thing is balance between all of those. Some homeostasis, if you want to drift it into the cybernetic direction. And which made me think of a funny circumstance that it apparently was the post-war West German politics that ultimately related the value of money to the gross domestic production. Because before that was an era of the golden standard, and basically your money is worth of what you have. And after that, it's like your money is worth of how much work your people can, or your industry is capable of. Yes. And this is the shift I'm talking about. This is the shift in the in the balance, like those little figurines that are balancing on the tip of the table, you know, like in a very odd balance, but clustered together. That's how I see our mentality, in a sense, and the self construction process.
Sure. So you're almost speaking of like the societal incentives that enable consciousness development, like in a large scale. And it's like in that regard, you're almost going to, I mean, one of my favorite topics, which is money, and the, like you said, this idea that, well, it's interesting that you pointed to GDP. Basically, GDP is, productivity gain versus some arbitrary metric of comparison versus, money supply or whatnot, or resource expenditure, you may say. The resource expenditure versus productivity. And
a difference between the gold that stands behind you. It's kind of the gold as a master deposit. If you treat money as in terms of how much gold you have in your golden reserve, you basically usually think about the procedure of taking it back. You're like, okay, how can I take it back? It's kind of the lack of trust. And the German, the West Germany answer to that was like, guys, it's not about how much you can take back from our bank. It's about how you can keep using this money because our economy works well.
Yeah.
So it's a different mentality. What I'm trying to say with that is that this probably the next level of our self-understanding will not hinge upon something we can understand in terms of contemporary thinking. It will be some other redistribution of what's valuable to us.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yes.
Yeah, and that loops back to COVID and rethinking of what's valuable to us, because we started thinking in different terms of what is actually important. Okay, life is fleeting. You can't have all the money in the world, or you can just expect your salary probably. So you will be valuing different processes in your life. You will create yourself as not the person who has this and this job, because the job's unstable. You're not the person who has these assets or these assets, because, like, come on, everyone can order it from AliExpress or wherever, Amazon. And that doesn't tell you who you are. Something else will tell you who you are. What do you think will tell us who we are?
Right. So that's interesting. So then that's where the idea here is that then at some point you have to ask who you are. And then at some point you can make the realization that, I can choose, but then there is another level and this is where it gets quite interesting, because there's kind of some different stages here, because you can get to the point where then you have to ask, well, there's values that I really value as a person. I want, I value being someone who cares for others, who provides, who is, who listens, who's empathetic, who, has good judgment and good morals and has, who's a man of character, who tells the truth, and like that could be on my gravestone, I want people to write he was those things, Yeah,
exactly.
And so, but then there's a final stage to this level, which is, well, what do those values mean, and who gets to choose what those values mean?
Yeah, and
this is where I think there's a lot of wisdom here in, like, if you look too long into the abyss, you can become the abyss. And that if you ask, well, where does meaning come from? And you can keep asking, where does meaning come from? You end up at, the core questions of philosophy. But it is a legitimate question. And this is why philosophy exists, because you do have to ask, well, what is being a man of integrity? What does that mean? What does it mean to tell the truth? Should I always tell the truth? When is there times when I shouldn't tell the truth? Well, if there is, well, why? And these become legitimate questions you have to ask at this point, Because before, all the stability was, oh, well, I am this person because of how I grew up and the things I am and the places I've been and the jobs I've had. So I don't have to ask and wonder. But then at some point, you have to start to ask and wonder. And those things then become, well, why does my brain believe these things in the first? Why does my brain believe anything? And you could start to ask those questions. And that's been, I mean, personally, that's been a process I've been on for a while now. And it's like, it really is a process that takes you down quite the rabbit hole in the journey. I don't think I would not be where I am today if I hadn't embarked on that journey, because you have to start asking those questions. And it really does suck though. Because like it's incredibly unstable. It's you're questioning everything about the world itself at that point. Have you had any experience along those lines for you, where like starting to question the meanings of the meanings, and what
absolutely,
does it look like?
Absolutely.
Right, I would assume.
I've been trying to find a job for in the industry for a couple of years, and then just realized, okay, I probably just made for academia, and academia endorsed me. I'm there now. Then that's a massive change in what is valuable, because for job seekers, portfolio maxing is very important. It is important sort of for academia as well, but that's still a realm where your insight, where your sudden enlightenment is valuable. Sure. It probably valuable over some over the amount of attempts to do something, or the drafts of your images, something like that. Yeah. So sort of it's sort of like your insight in the workings of the ego that basically brought you here, as I understand. Like you just had an understanding of that at some point, and there you go. That is valuable. That just sort of overrides a lot of stuff and suddenly makes you an inventor.
Well, that's quite interesting, right? Yeah, right. Because, so this is the idea. Oh, so even in this book right here, it's like, this is Roger Penrose. He argued, this is Emperor's New Mind. He was the first physicist to argue that the brain is quantum. And he argued that, in this book specifically, he argues that the brain is non-algorithmic. So Alan Turing came up with the idea of Turing machines and Turing complete logic, which then Roger Penrose argued that while that works great for computers and for mathematics, he argued that the brain has some sort of non-computable, non-algorithmic understanding. And that points to the fact that the brain likely uses quantum, because quantum is the only way we know to have a non-algorithmic understanding. So then what you're saying is you just know at some point. So you're saying you can know something you can know something's true and valuable without being able to articulate why. Because is that what you just said?
Sort of.
Like I said, so yeah, explain that to me. So was that what you were saying? Like the idea here is that you could say, "Oh, that's valuable." You can like almost experience it as valuable in some sense.
Yeah, in this sense, totally. It's a change of perspective, and that's what makes the hologram, or this crystal with a laser picture inside, such an amazing metaphor for that, I think.
Yes.
For consciousness, because it's about shining a light and through the whole structure without differentiating, and it either shines red or it shines green depending on what sort of frequency you pass over there. So it's like there's no logical passage from 1 to 2 to 3 and everything. That is more about just instantaneously seeing if it vibes. That's why also vibes are important.
That is so beautifully said. Basically the idea here, and this is exactly what Carl, I really, really love Carl Jung's work. And he said in the Red Book that understanding, it provides a bridge to return, but explanation is murder, is what he said. Explanation is murder, but understanding provides a bridge to return. And then he said, can you count the murderers among the scholars? And and I was like, wow. And that's basically exactly what you were saying, is that there's this intrinsic understanding to the experience. But then if you try to articulate it, something is lost. And you can't even articulate what is lost in the explanation. But there is some sort of knowing that exceeds verbal explanation. And that's what Roger Penrose was trying to say, was that verbal explanation cannot capture the understanding of a non-algorithmic system, because language is algorithmic. There's grammar, it's system 2, it's the logic. But what he's saying is that system 1 then would be this understanding, and this would be the idea from our paper, from the switching paper, would be is that the system 1, the quantum, when it resolves, if it resolves in a state that is coherent with something that is that would provide a systematic way of understanding without the ego's ability to articulate the understanding fully. And it might take you a long time to even articulate it in a way that sort of represents what you just thought or experienced. But the expression itself is extremely lossy, compressive, low informational bitrate system of explaining the understanding and the experience you just had. Like, a picture is worth 1,000 words, literally, in that regard.
Yeah. Your explanations, when you gave me some explanations on how that works, made me think of a membrane that is susceptible to different subtle changes in the atmosphere. Something that doesn't give you a rational strategy, but something that allows you to be sensitive to the environment.
Yeah.
That sort of, I mean, we talked about the part of the quantum mind, basically, how that works. And that sort of makes you into not even a live wire, as Talking Heads would put it, but into a membrane that, or like a spider web that
Sure.
is touched in some area, and the spider of your mind, that's apparently the conscious part, is a spider that's creeping there to figure out whether there is something to explore.
Absolutely, totally. I mean, and I would feel like, you're an artist, and I would assume that, like, when you're making art, it's like you're not sitting there explaining why you're making the art you're making. The explanation is not part of the creative process. There's no explanation when you're making art. You just make art. And then afterwards, you can apply an explanation if you'd like. But generally, it's like, doesn't that defeat the purpose of the art? The art is the thing,
I think probably so. There is some sort of a pleasant feeling of losing yourself in the flow, and I think that's what people love about the flow. So for that matter, it's kind of interesting to think of that, because I think it would be wrong to say that it's just pleasant because you have extra energy. That would be a very materialist, capitalist way to explain it. Like, we got more, we can stack more, we can waste less. That is pleasant. Yeah. No, I don't think that works like that. And your research can actually lead to the answer. Why is it so pleasant to just lose yourself in the music the moment you own it? Why? Did you have a nudge in this direction during your research?
Yes, absolutely. So then the idea here would be is that the flow, it's because like you said, it's not because you have more energy, because actually your brain's using the same amount of energy. It's about what the brain's using the energy for. And so in that regard, like you said, the pleasantness of it would be is that, like, when you're deep in an incredibly immersive art experience, you're not thinking about anything besides the moment and the thing. And all of your energy is being used in that moment. So it's not like you're like, oh, thank God I have so much more energy right now. It's more like, I'm so present in this moment, and it's such a rich, deep experience. There's so much, the experience itself feels so real and so powerful that, like, the experience itself is so much different than waking normal consciousness. Like, I mean, even like the conversation we're having right now is a flow state of sorts as well, where, like, 3 hours ago after I ate my late night snack and I was sitting here like slow and like I did some push-ups to get the energy flowing. Like, that was a completely different state of mind than what's happening right here, because I'm not here thinking about how this is going to go or how this is going to look or what I'm looking like right now or like all these self-referential processing thoughts. The information and the effort is not intentional. I'm not, it's not guided. Just in the same way for you as an artist, I'm sure you're not thinking about where the next step should be. It's just happening.
Yeah, definitely. I think I experienced a lot of that working as a journalist, because when you're talking with the people, it's exactly the moment when they're too tired to press their conscious agenda when you get the best stuff. It's in a sense pretty tiring to be on the point for a long time. I think people can hold it for an hour, at max an hour and a half. And after that, they kind of lower the masks and start being themselves and actually explore the possibilities. That is
that's
really
interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting that for some news agencies, it's an irrelevant thing. They would already go away. But for in-depth interviews, that's where it comes. The whole magic comes from.
I agree. And that makes so much sense from the switching mechanisms idea here, because again, the default mode network is so expensive. It's so metabolically expensive. It's again, parts of it are 40% above baseline of the brain. And so if you are in this, like, I need to maintain this certain self-image about myself, I have to control this interview and like not give up too much. And like, I need to be portrayed in a certain way. And people who are watching this need to think about me in this way. Like, there's so much internal processing going on there, so much default mode network, self-referential thinking. That is incredibly expensive, which would be experienced as anxiety and negative emotions in general. So that's the experience of it would be negative emotions. And in that, it's so exhausting and so tiring negative emotions are so much more exhausting and tiring than positive emotions. And there's probably a reason for that, because the default mode network is quite literally, the self-referential processing is legitimately so much more expensive. And so in that regard, then, it's no surprise that they can only maintain it for so long before that's like, okay, the siege has worked. You can enter the city gates, like,
yeah, exactly. That's just so great that you dived into the workings of all that, because all the different levels of consciousness, of course, to an extent, it's what is carved in the terrain.
Yes,
but
yes.
Discovering the workings of the actual flow is precious, for that matter.
Well, because then if you haven't, like, for me at least, there's been a really beautiful recursive feedback loop here, as I've kind of, stripped, really just through, this method of observation, stripped away a lot of old beliefs that just weren't serving anything anymore. And then from that, it frees up landscape, mental energy, and then new ideas emerge. And then in that same regard, like, the self and the ego are all trying to defend the current state. But if you can dissolve how much it has to defend, it frees you up to just be in the moment itself. And so when you know that this mechanism is trying to do that, you can actually start to see through the mechanism a bit, like, oh, it's trying to do that right now. It's like having an awareness of it does serve some like legitimate purpose for the human experience, I think, where like most science papers, they don't really have any application to real life, but I feel like this paper, if you can literally, like, oh, like in a flow state, the self-referential thinking of who I am is quieting. Oh, and then like when it's really, really, really strong, I'm never going to experience that flow and where the creative, generative parts of my life emerge. So if you can find ways to dissolve beliefs, dissolve the need to be something, dissolve the need for things to go a certain way, the most optimal thing comes out, and that's art. art is the thing that emerges from the lack of expectation. And
you made me think right now that actually your discoveries can influence the educational area really much, because a lot in schools is about creating this ego or some sort of a subordinate ego, ego of a student, to create the image of a good student, or to be an achiever who is running for a mark or something like that. And we probably are inspiring that to an extent, unless we send our kids to Waldorf schools and that sort of, immersive education. So there can be actually something underneath this immersive education that is not just learning by doing, that is also dissolving your awareness of this world of statuses and world of personalities, in order to free some mental space to explore the possibilities, to be more creative in your biology class or in a chemistry class, to explore the whole potential better. It literally would evolve into different techniques, I would say, of not feeding DMT to kids. Let's avoid the Ritalin part. But in principle, I think a little bit of a meditation ahead of a mathematics class could probably work.
I would entirely agree. And also the approach that one takes, the beliefs that one has about the school itself matters so much, because, if you're there to achieve, and like there's a goal at hand, the goal is shaping the action itself. So if your goal is to get an A, you're going to do the things it takes to get an A. But if your goal is to learn as much as possible, you're going to do the things it takes to learn as much as possible. And those create vastly different actions. Because let me tell you, I got good grades and learned nothing. So
same. In some aspects, definitely.
Right, exactly. In certain grades, I made sure to get good. There were certain, topics I made sure I did not learn anything in, and just copied my friends and got good grades, But like, did that serve me in the long run? No, like it clearly did not. It was serving the system of school, And so, to your point, the system itself is very important, because that builds the incentive of action, and it builds the potential goals that you as students are going to adopt. And the goals are what shape the action landscape, because again, remember how we talked about how beliefs are these wells of action. And so, like, just like in gravity, things fall into the basins. It's easy to go downhill. So beliefs shape the action landscape. So if you think my goals are also beliefs, because goals are intentions to the future. I believe my future should go along these lines. In that regard, then, like a goal is shaping the action landscape, creating a certain path that's more likely. So like when people say like, oh, manifest your goals. Well, yeah, like having a goal does create a higher likelihood that the goal is going to happen, because you have a goal. And so,
fair enough. Or for that matter, if you learn to follow the rules, you eventually learn how to follow the rules better, or you learn eternally how to construct yourself, like how to build up your brand. Well, you're gonna eventually end up selling T-shirts.
Right. It's like in that regard,
NFTs, probably.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because so this is the idea here, is that like you can't escape the beliefs themselves. So the only way to escape the beliefs is to not have beliefs. So can you actually dissolve the need to have a goal? And if you can dissolve but this requires a certain orientation to the self, because otherwise telling someone who still believes that roles are how one identifies himself, telling them to dissolve the need to be a self, it's like, what are you talking about? It's like you have to go down this path for certain things to make sense. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense. But like, in this regard, you can actually begin to dissolve beliefs. And then from that, a different action landscape. And again, I use the word action landscape, but it's the same thing as an energy landscape. Water flows downhill in the same way the action. But I like the word action because it's inferring that energy generates action. And in a human perspective, that is literally what it is. Your beliefs shape your actions because of the energy and how it's flowing. So in a human perspective, it's the exact same word. And so I think that's a fascinating way to think about it and why beliefs matter so much. And then this goes to the consciousness levels, because if you are your values and if you are your values and your purpose, and then you start to ask, well, what are my values and what are my purpose, and who defines values and purpose? You can get to this point where then you have to ask, well, who is the person defining the values and purpose? Why is there even a person in the first place? And this is where you can get to this point where, like, potentially you can get to this level of seeing through the ego itself in some regard. And then you can get into this collaborative process with the ego in some regard where then that's where then you can start to notice, oh, this thing is happening, but do I have to associate with that thing? And the beauty of life is you don't actually have to associate with the thing. You can just say, oh, look, it's happening. And then let it, fall back into the ocean. So this is kind of getting...
Yeah, or you can regard possibilities of becoming a different person and think about a type of job you would like to have, where to go. You don't really need to see it as a thing you definitely would like to pursue. As something, it's just browsing through different possibilities that's made possible by this difference in the processing in the brain that you're talking about. So it's just because of that we can allow ourselves to imagine a different future for ourselves, or choose where to go altogether, without jumping at the first opportunity that comes to your mind, so to speak.
Absolutely. So, like, in that regard, again, like, because if you have preconceived beliefs, your ego will not let you explore those options. Like, again, the ego has a belief landscape, and then that is shaping what you can explore. So, like, what you just said is, well, I'm going to explore all these options. But for someone who has different beliefs, those options won't exist. Like, they will not be options. And so this is where one's orientation to their self, what their core beliefs are, whether they are their roles, their actions, or their values, or whatever, and then whatever those specific things are, changes the search landscape. And that would be a literal biophysical energetic property of how the brain works. And then that would literally have an effect on how you act in the world.
Yeah, it makes me think that it is also really useful for the strategy of education, because probably education by facts is more is the thing that appeals to your rational brain more than to this electromagnetic field of potentialities, and that is sort of wrong because it probably narrows down the scope, the basin of your possible thoughts a bit too soon, and there needs to be some convergence divergence shape that designers love so much, that probably sets forth some irrigation channels and then allows a massive flood to destroy this all to an extent during a phase of what ifs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great point. So absolutely, because then you're saying is that, if you say, oh, this is how the world works, this is how this thing about the world works, and there's no other option. And now your brain has to believe that, right? So you're saying, oh, this is a propositional fact about how the world works, and you need to believe it. And then so as a kid, you're like, okay, I guess I believe it now. And then, but you have no reason why. You just have to believe the thing. And so then in that regard, now you're right. That is literally shaping the landscape of informational search now, because you haven't examined that belief at all. You have no idea. You don't even know why you believe it. And the opposite of that is, okay, yeah, maybe you could actually learn. Could you teach? I mean, there's probably a certain level of fact about about world. Like there are certain facts that we know for almost certain. Okay. Sure. So maybe those things are absolutely worth learning, you know?
Yeah, it's probably no good, forming sexual relations with close relatives and eating other people is also not a good idea.
Sure. And like water
Those are really
water is
embedded,
H2O. You know, like water is H2O and you should drink water. Like, okay, yeah.
Yeah, that as well. 2 plus 2 equals 4.
So then of course someone will say, well, then what is at what point is a fact not a fact? And like, okay, fair enough. There's probably a gray area, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bergson needed like 200 something pages to prove that 1 plus 1 actually equals 2. So you can't doubt that probably.
Yeah.
But to your point, shall not steal.
Right. But to your point though, is as adults, as people who have the ability to modify their own beliefs, well, then what actually serves your ability to think clearly? Is it knowing facts, or is it knowing the least amount possible to maneuver through the action landscape? So maybe the key to actually think clearly is to eliminate facts about the world in your mind. And so then you get to the cringe term. The cringe term is first principles. Like everyone talks about first principles. But I think there is wisdom in that. Like, what is the least you can know to effectively explore? And then, like you said, will understanding, will insight hit you? Will it arrive? And I do think there might be something to that. If you can shift your mentality from I know things about the world to there are things about the world that seem somewhat probable, and you start thinking in like this probabilistic mindset, that is a quantum system of thinking. Instead of thinking in binaries, the world is this or the world is not this, you can start thinking in the world may be this or may not be this, and there's a probability distribution between them. And I think you can actually shift how your brain relates to facts in general. And so instead of saying God exists or God does not exist, or hitting a person is always horrible, because in some situations hitting a person is right. You might have to hit someone because they might be harming someone else. So like, is hitting someone always wrong? It is somewhat arbitrary at times. Like, you have to fight wars. At some point you have to fight a war. Like, you may want to not fight wars, but at some point you have to.
Absolutely. I think it's sort of the idea of reframing, as in Goffman's frames, that essentially give you the operational scenario. Okay, what is a drill? Military drills? Well, it's like war, but you don't kill anyone. That sort of stuff. And I'm thinking that is. Like keeping yourself in the superposition of ideas is probably possible if you apply metaphoric redressing of things. It's how I studied mathematics when I was a kid. I hated mathematics, but I was creating stories about these little numbers that go across the border, and then they are split into different groups and go into different professions. I mean, it made me linger for way too long on mathematics, but at least I could finish it. And I think that is probably the only way to sort of rationally know things. You cannot unknow things probably, but also stay open to the possibilities, because how to best demonstrate it, how to redress things. I'm thinking poetry. Poetry is wonderful with that. I love that in the English language, the mirror of a god is dog. And you're like, okay, if you redress God as a dog, and it doesn't necessarily have to be offensive in any way. There was a Dominican order that means Dominicanis is like the dogs of God. So Yeah, that's why they call it like that. I also
That's
found
interesting.
it fascinating. But if you redress a god into a dog, then you start thinking in the paradigm of a dog about God. That
Sure.
changes something, and that allows you to explore different paths. You would never probably think of, I mean, is God actually loyal to you? Is God, does God choose alliances, or does God stay with the pack? And this metaphoric redressing is probably a pathway to this divergent thinking.
Well, also, then you could think about what another beauty of poetry or art in general is the interpretation of meaning, because, just like a song can mean any piece of art can mean one thing to one person and an entirely different thing to someone else. So is the meaning inherent in the art, or is the meaning inherent in the participation between the person and the art? And so then you have to ask, well, where is the meaning located in the art? Is it intrinsic to it, or is it actually something about the person and their experience of the art in the moment? But then that allows for meaning itself to be relevant and subjective. And if meaning is relevant and subjective, what does that say about the human experience and how the brain works? Because then if meaning is subjective in art, well, then why does meaning have to be objective anywhere? Couldn't it be subjective everywhere? And if that's the case, then what does that look like? And why would that be the case? And I think that's important to think about in relation to how the brain works probabilistically. Because again, like the idea here is, well, it doesn't have to be a binary, this is what it means. It's a subjective distribution of possibilities. So maybe intrinsic in the art is 150 different meanings. And you are the lucky person to pick one of the 150. But there's 149 other people who now get the opportunity to find the meaning in the art. So maybe the art is actually a distribution of meanings. And in that same way, just like anything is a distribution of probabilities. So there is some sort of connection here between probability and meaning that I think is underexplored. I hadn't thought about this before till right now. So that's very interesting.
I think it beautifully loops back to the default network, because essentially you pass art through your own ego to
your own
define what is the meaning of this art.
Yes.
Otherwise, I think we're losing that. In a sense, because predominant meanings were a very big thing in our religious cultures. Like the meaning is stated and defined in the book, and that was sort of a habit of our mentality. But now I think we can agree that if a painting made you feel a certain way, if a painting reminds you of your grandma's scarf that she's knitted for you at some point for Christmas, that is a legit meaning of this painting. It is in the eyes of the beholder, but it is this meaning inside your system. That is what that art means to you. This is how it incorporates in your world, if you want.
Yeah. Oh, my word. Yes. And this is why I think music is so beautiful about this, because music oftentimes uses this. It's very literal, because a song may say like you, and it'll say you are my everything, or like, I don't want to be anything like you, or something like that. But the you could be 100 different things. And then the you could be metaphorical. And like, I love Linkin Park's one of my favorite bands, and a lot of their songs are very much like that, where they say something like, they use the word you, but then people interpret it as, oh, they're my girlfriend or my boyfriend or my my love interest or whatever. But then it could also be about yourself, me, like, oh, I don't want to be anything like you, me, my old self or my new self or the part of myself I hate, but like that could be interpreted by the beholder in the same way. So like, just like you said,
interesting. Sorry, man.
Oh,
I
no,
thought
please,
of
please,
Linkin
please.
Park. God, I love it. God, I love it. I used to love it as a teenager. Playing air guitar to that.
Oh, yeah.
But noticed that the perception of that really evolves with more experience, because when you are a teenager, you literally identify with the I. I'm thinking less of a you, more of an I, because this is just about me, and this feeling is very rarely accessible when you are more of an adult. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Because like to me, I didn't discover stupid to say that, but like discover Linkin Park until later. Because like I didn't get into Linkin Park till like a few years ago, really. Because like before that, I was like, they're fine. But I never was, something in me changed. And then this orientation of me changed where I suddenly was like, you know what? I'm in, And so I was like, I don't know. Basically, you may say that the reference, if you want to go technical with it, like whatever Linkin Park's informational reference beam is, didn't align well with the previous configuration of Josh. And then at some point, things shifted in me, which allowed for Linkin Park to resonate more deeply. And then now, suddenly, they've become, one of my favorite bands. Also, they relaunched their band with their new female vocal lead singer, so that was part of why. But that's a whole nother story. But the idea here is, I think, again, the idea that art, the art is baked into art, is a massive amount of compressed meanings that are accessible to the person. And I think the best art probably is somehow like, when I say best, I mean the most famous, maybe, or the ones that resonate most with people. Maybe that's the best way to say it. Are the ones that have the widest range of potential meanings that could connect with someone, because then it's most receptive to the largest audience in some sense. But then
maybe for that matter, folklore music is very metaphorical and goes about songbirds mating, about some herbs and other beings of nature. There's a lot of this sort of natural metaphors there, and they apply to anyone. That anyone can dress themselves in a nightingale and a dove. But I thought also it would be so interesting. Recently, I was translating poetry of one band from a Russian band from the Urals into English, and I can show you later.
Very much. That's very interesting.
A lot of effort to translate the feeling, so to speak.
Sure.
But I noticed a funny thing with my dad. I read the lyrics to him. He was like, "Oh my God, what a despicable, inhumane band." Well, they're telling grim stories. That is the case. But when he heard a song with the music, it's like, yeah, I understand. Now I can feel it. And I was thinking to myself, since then, probably it's different parts of the brain that that can relate. Like the musical experience is as much about the harmony of the notes and the words as it is about just the harmony of the meanings, about the text as such.
Well, I think that's really good. That's actually a really interesting experimental kind of setup almost, because like the words themselves, I mean, the default mode network operates in words. The currency of the DMN is words, is language. So then what does music do? Well, it's bypassing all of that. Music is just, it's literally rhythms of information. They're literally sound waves with phase and with packed of information that our ears interpret in a pretty incredible, remarkable way, that they're able to interpret that. And then we experience music. But the experience is bottom up. So this is what you're saying, is it's not the top down stuff. Language is top down, default mode network. But the music and the information, that's bottom up. That's deep in the brain. So then that's very interesting, because then what you're saying is that the connection with the music and the language creates a different response than just the language alone, which then points to something about the fact that that the language, why would the language alone produce an entirely different response if there wasn't two separate mechanisms at play here? And that's quite interesting, I think. And I hadn't really thought about it in that perspective before, but that's a really, really interesting. I'll have to think more about that.
Yeah, because probably it also touches base with vibrations, the oscillations. I mean, it's all about some sort of waves. I mean, the quantum mind and the music is different sorts of waves, of course, but to an extent, it's periodic oscillations.
Yes.
And I would not exclude that it could be connected in a way, because there's a lot of effects of different frequencies that we can find that find an emotional corporal response in us. For that matter, recently I've heard of the experiment where people took two groups of people and gave one group a piece of music and another group this same piece of music with infrasound added on top of it that you don't hear but you feel. And the first group said, "Oh, that's such a relaxing, wonderful music." And the one that experienced the infrasound said, "God, it's so grim, it's so spooky, eerie. I don't like it." And that can be actually also the mechanism behind cats fleeing from the earthquakes and tsunamis, you know, animals generally being able to predict this sort of events.
Right, because there's so much information that our biological systems are missing out on. And that's a great point from the biophysical side of things as well, because the informational landscape is so vast. And even though we only tap into such a small level of it, we still have too much information and our brains can't even classically deal with that much information. So like the fact that like we only see a puny spectrum of the light rays that hit, that we can't see X-ray, we can't see ultraviolet, we can't see gamma, we can't see all those frequencies, but they're all there. And like manta rays, like shrimp can see a huge spectrum of those light rays that we can't see. So we don't even have colors for what they can see, so that's pretty insane.
Unbelievable. Super. I think it's just a super interesting conversation, but I realize it's almost three something in your place, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So I would be
I know.
Really
we talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes or something. Insane.
We are unstoppable. We're unstoppable. I just have some compassion in my soul that says you gotta also have a good night's sleep at some point.
Man, it's all right.
It's amazing to talk with you because your brain also operates in this wide branching manner.
Dude, we can go anywhere. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I hope to hear more about your discoveries. And
dude, I want to hear more about what you're doing too.
In general. Definitely. So see you in the next episode.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's been real. And dude, talk to you very soon. This was an absolute blast.
My pleasure. See you soon.
See you, man.